He's a wanted man and in hiding. Yahya Sinwar is named the political leader of Hamas after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh. With no end in sight to Israel's war on Gaza, what does this mean for ceasefire talks? And will Hamas under Sinwar be different? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Hamas has a new political leader. Yahya Sinwar, described by some as a hardline strategist, spent more than 2 decades in Israeli prisons and now holds unprecedented power within the movement. His appointment comes a week after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. Sinwar is poised to make crucial decisions on both military operations and diplomatic negotiations. Israel accuses him of masterminding the October attacks, which led to the war on Gaza. So with Sinwar at the helm, what are the prospects for a ceasefire? And how will Hamas balance its political and military ambitions? We'll delve deeper into this with our panel of guests, but first, this report from Axel Zaimovich.
Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, has been chosen as the movement's new political leader. His predecessor, Ismail Haniyeh, was assassinated in the Iranian capital last week.
Sinwar was chosen unanimously, and this shows that the movement is aware of the nature of all the difficulties that it's facing. Negotiations were managed by leadership, and Sinwar was always present.
Sinwar's path to leadership is marked by wars. Born in a refugee camp in Khan Yunis, he spent 22 years in Israeli prisons before being released in a 2011 prisoner exchange, a deal signed by Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel accuses him of masterminding the October attacks on southern Israel, and the Prime Minister describes him as a dead man walking. The International Criminal Court has sought arrest warrants for Sinwar and other senior Hamas officials, as well as for Netanyahu and the Israeli Defense Minister for alleged war crimes. Sinwar will now represent Hamas in negotiations towards a ceasefire and the release of Israeli captives. He is suspected to be hiding in Gaza's extensive network of tunnels, which analysts say could pose a challenge if he is to approve any potential deal. Sinwar is also at the top of Israel's most wanted list. Captives' families accuse Prime Minister Netanyahu of derailing the talks by assassinating Haniyeh.
The situation is one in which we need to have significant pressure on everybody, whoever is to blame, to accept these terms, get the ceasefire done, do the exchanges, and move on to the next phase, which is going to be even more complicated, to govern Palestine and to possibly lead, once the Israelis leave Gaza, to lead to a negotiation for a permanent resolution of the Palestine-Israel conflict.
Sinwar's decision will likely shape Gaza's future beyond Israel's war. As a man who has experienced displacement, imprisonment, and occupation throughout his life, his perspective will be crucial in determining Hamas's path forward. Axel Zaimovich, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. From New York, we're joined by Omar Rahman, a fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. He focuses on Middle East geopolitics and American foreign policy in the region. In Belfast is Professor Beverly Milton Edwards, co-author of Hamas, The Quest for Power, and a former EU special advisor to the Middle East peace process. And also in New York is Norman Finkelstein, a political scientist and activist who specializes in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Omar, let me start with you today. The naming of Yahya Sinwar as the leader of Hamas's political wing, what is the message that sends?
Well, first and foremost, I think it is a message of resilience and defiance from the organization, that you can kill one leader and there will be a seamless transition to another. And I think the speed and efficiency in which that happened within a week of the killing of Ismail Haniyeh is rather remarkable, especially without a designated successor. I think it's also, a finger in the eye of the Israelis. On October 7th, the Israelis vowed to kill both Sinwar and destroy Hamas. And here we are 10 months later, despite the full brunt of the Israeli war machine, and both Sinwar and Hamas are alive and kicking, and now he is leading the movement.
Beverly, based on your extensive knowledge of Hamas, was the announcement that Yahya Sinwar had become Hamas's overall leader, was that expected or did that come as a surprise?
No, it's no surprise really that Sinwar has taken on the mantle of the leadership of the movement overall. We need to remember that he's played a pivotal role since he was elected as leader to Gaza in 2015. And his sort of control of the tactics to help the movement achieve its objectives has been really key to the events that have unfolded really since 2020, 2021. So it's no surprise really. And as Omar says, really it's a sort of endorsement of Hamas's determination to continue their fight on behalf of the Palestinian people against an Israeli occupier. And their narrative has very much centered on, here is yet another leader from the people, born of the people, born in a refugee camp, who's experiencing the same kinds of experiences of Israeli occupation and Israeli siege that everyone else in the West Bank, Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem is.
Norman, from your perspective, what do you think all of this will mean for Gaza and for the people of Gaza going forward?
I think there are two things that need to be kept in mind. Number one, Israel is no doubt euphoric about the choice of Sinwar, because historically Israel has always dreaded most what are called the moderates on the Palestinian side. When it launched its attack on Lebanon in June 1982, the purpose of the attack was to defeat the moderate leadership of the PLO, which at that point was on record supporting a two-state settlement, in the hope that the moderate leadership would be displaced by a quote-unquote radical leadership, and then Israel can do as it always wants to do, throw its hands up in despair and to pretend there's nobody to negotiate with. The same thing happened in 2012 when Israel assassinated Ahmed Jabari, who was actually Israel's interlocutor up until that point, but trying to negotiate a long-term ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. There was talk at the time that not only would there be a short-term, but a long-term ceasefire, and Jabari was the point man, and Israel proceeded to assassinate him. So I do believe that Israel is probably elated by this choice, because now it can say, how can we possibly negotiate with the mastermind of October 7th? And the other point I would bear in mind is that the choice of Sinwar as the leader is a signal that Hamas doesn't believe that negotiations are possible with Israel. And in fact, I think that is a reasonable inference. As Sinwar said in a previous interview, I guess from 2021 or 2022, he said, we tried everything. We tried diplomacy. We tried nonviolent civil resistance, the Great March of Return. Nothing worked. And so the election of Sinwar is a signal that the Hamas side has, of course, they'll agree to a short-term ceasefire, but long-term, they no longer believe there's any possibility of coexistence with Israel.
Omar, it looked to me like you were reacting to some of what Norman was saying, so I'll give you a chance to jump in. But I also wanted to ask you to follow up on a point that he was making. Norman had said that from his perspective, Israel would have been elated now with the appointment of Sinwar as its political leader. What do you think of that?
I agree. I think Netanyahu is probably joyous over this appointment. At the same time, I mean, there is a flip side to that, and that is that Netanyahu is responsible for the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh. So if you are an outside observer who was looking at Haniyeh and the negotiations that were happening in Qatar as good faith negotiations that may have led somewhere, then Netanyahu is responsible for the outcome of that, the killing of the negotiator and the setback in those negotiations. And if you're an Israeli whose family member is a hostage there, then you might be upset over that kind of thing. That yes, Sinwar is the boogeyman that has been portrayed to the Israeli public, but at the same time, Netanyahu was responsible for his rise as the political leader within Hamas, as opposed to the Ismail Haniyeh type of figure.
Beverly, let me ask you, how will Hamas go about balancing military strategy and political calculations going forward? I mean, what's to be expected?
Well, I think that the balance will remain pretty much the same. I mean, with Sinwar in charge from Gaza, we already know that there's a determination by the Asdin al-Qassam brigades to continue its armed attacks, its resistance directed at Israel and Israeli targets. And now that's going to take place in the context of huge amount of fears around regional escalation as a result of that assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran and the attacks on the second in command of Hezbollah in Lebanon. So in that respect, it will be pretty much business as usual, and the Sinwar will rely on the same set of trusted lieutenants and commanders from the Asdin al-Qassam brigades, who he knows well and has worked with intimately. In terms of the political calculations, yes, I think there's much to agree with on the points from Omar and Norman regarding the negotiations. I would, on the other hand, point out a couple of things. The first is that we need to remember that despite everything that Israel has said since October the 7th about Yahya Sinwar, he has been key to all of the negotiations that have taken place and mediated by countries like Qatar and Egypt since October the 7th. And that includes the decision back in late November to have those original hostage releases in exchange for some humanitarian relief and prisoner exchanges or release of Palestinian prisoners from the West Bank. So that was down to his say-so. And his voice and his opinion is intrinsic to any kind of decision-making in terms of the politics of what happens next with respect to the war. And, it's not like Sinwar hasn't offered truce conditions to Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu in the past. He did this in 2021. It was revealed in 2022 that he had written a letter offering those terms for at least for a ceasefire, if not for peace with Israel. So both Norman and Omar are right to sort of point the finger back, so to speak, and in terms of the political calculations and political considerations to all the parties that are currently engaged in this conflict. And those parties not only include the government of Israel, but also include the security and intelligence services in Israel, who we now know are really pushing at Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire deal so that there can be some movement, so that there could maybe even be a hint of a political horizon. But of course, working against that as well is whether or not and the extent to which the Biden administration in the US will apply any leverage whatsoever on Bibi Netanyahu to progress these talks.
Norman, it looked to me as though you wanted to add to what Beverly was saying there. If so, please go ahead.
I entered the caveat in my remarks. I said that, of course, Mr. Sinwar is going to work towards a ceasefire in Gaza and hopefully a long-term ceasefire in Gaza. However, what I had in mind in my remarks was to say that there was at least a hope held out that beyond a ceasefire, there would be a possibility for some longer-term resolution, if not a permanent resolution, of the conflict. Mr. Sinwar is a perfectly intelligent person, and he knows full well that Israel will never agree to not just Bibi Netanyahu, but the entire Israeli state and society. They would never agree to a long-term ceasefire and peaceful coexistence with Sinwar as the head of state or head of Hamas and effectively head of state in Gaza. And by elevating him to his new position. I'm not saying he was wrong in his conclusions. I think there's a perfectly compelling case that you cannot negotiate with Israel, just like Israel's determined, come hell or high water, to go to war with Iran and inflict a colossal military defeat on it, including the possible use of nuclear weapons. I don't believe it's possible to engage with or achieve a peaceful coexistence with the state of Israel, at least in its current incarnation. And so when they elevated Sinwar, and Sinwar understood himself that when I achieve this status, it means there's no possibility of a peaceful coexistence long-term with Israel, because I, meaning Sinwar, I recognize they will never agree to that with me as the head of state. I'm the mastermind of October 7th. And in fact, they're euphoric at the prospect. They have nobody to negotiate with, and therefore they have to use what is the only weapon in their arsenal, the weapon of force. The Israelis in the West are fond of saying the only language Arabs understand is the language of force. And in fact, that's a projection. The only language the Israelis understand is the language of force. I guess there's an adage in Israel: if force doesn't work, use more force. That's their mentality, unfortunately.
Omar, you heard Beverly a few minutes ago talk about how crucial Sinwar was up until now in the negotiating process when it comes to the talks surrounding a potential ceasefire. I want to ask you, how much was he involved in the negotiations up until now? Did he always have final say?
I mean, it's difficult to know fully, the balance in that room in terms of decision making. But at the end of the day, the hostages are being held in Gaza, not in Qatar, where the negotiations were taking place. The fighting is being done in Gaza. And I mean, we have to understand that, the most defining decision made by a Hamas leader in a very long time was the decision to move forward with the October 7th attack. That was a decision, as far as we know, that was made by the leadership within Gaza, Sinwar being one of them, and not by Haniya and Khaled Mashal necessarily in Qatar. So I think the decision making is happening there, and they have more leverage in what decision is ultimately made.
So Beverly, Omar there was talking about the divisions between, Hamas leadership in Gaza, Hamas leadership outside of Gaza. Let me ask you, is there now more of a separation between Hamas leaders that are inside Gaza and those outside Gaza? And does that take leverage away from those leaders who are outside of Gaza?
No, I think that the balance of power, if you want to call it that, is the same as it ever has been. And this has been part of the challenge for Israel, which is always, whether it was against the PLO or the other elements of the Palestinian National Movement, have always sought to use a strategy of divide and rule. And they've always found this like almost simply impossible with Hamas and the Hamas leadership. So Hamas, prides itself on having a very sort of strict lines of communication. Decision making is jointly made. No one individual can outvote or outpower another individual when it comes to these kinds of crucial decisions about objectives and or tactics. So I don't really see that there's going to be much of a difference, because the leadership outside fully understand and appreciate everything that people in Gaza, the 2.3 million people who are living and suffering in Gaza are going through. So they believe that it's important to remain steadfast. It's important to maintain unity in the ranks. I don't really see that there's going to be any difference in that. What I would like to remind everybody is that, in one sense, if there is a deal, Sinwar will be key in the monitoring and verification of that deal, as he was back in November when Israeli and other nationalities were released from the custody of Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups in Gaza. So on the one hand, whether Israel likes it or not, they might prefer, if a deal was achieved, to have somebody like Sinwar, who has a track record for keeping to his word and maintaining those moments of verification of such deals as agreed, than somebody else who's much more of an unknown entity.
Beverly, let me also just ask you, if you're talking about the possibilities or the steps that might be taken to try to achieve a deal, Sinwar, we know, is at the top of Israel's hit list. They've said as much several times. I mean, how does it work in a negotiation, in talks, if he is now the lead negotiator? Because in the past, no matter how much one person or another, had final say, you still had somebody like Hania as an interlocutor for mediators. How does it work now?
Well, I think we need to understand that there's more than just Sinwar leading the negotiations. So whilst he's in Gaza, and sometimes communications with Gaza have been difficult or have been delayed, back in Doha, Sinwar will rely on a set of very experienced leaders and interlocutors, and that includes Khalid Mashal, Musa Abu Marzouk, Khalil al-Haya, all of whom have, again, been playing a very important role in coordinating positions, discussing positions, looking at Israeli proposals, looking at what's on the table and trying to make decisions, trying to draw up red lines, trying to understand where and how they can make compromises, all of which in an environment which, of course, is very volatile and subject to all sorts of very human pressures. So, I mean, in that respect, again, he's not the only person that the Mossad leadership and CIA and the Qatari mediators are talking to, and that we need to be very clear about. We need to understand that these are groups of people who are engaged in very delicate processes of negotiation with another belligerent actor on the side, and both can be accused of spoiling actions, both can be accused of failing to engage in confidence building measures or offering hope and then taking it away again at the last minute. And that applies both to the families of Israeli hostages and those of other nationalities who've been held in Gaza for the last 10 months, as it does to the millions of Palestinians who are suffering in Gaza and counting the dead, whether they're women and children as well as the elderly.
Omar, I saw you reacting just now to what Beverly was saying. Looked like you wanted to jump in again, so please go ahead.
No, I think she outlined it perfectly. But I was just going to say that, Hamas is not an organization of one-man rule, and that, being the political head of Hamas, Sinwar is not necessarily, just a negotiator. He has, I'm sure, emissaries and has empowered another set of leaders that are already based in Qatar to do those type of things, whether he's making, decisions, or ultimate decisions, or he's empowered people. I mean, that's the way the organization is structured. So I wouldn't say, every word is going to be conveyed to Sinwar and Gaza, and it has to go through those logistical hurdles.
Norman, if we could just take a step back for a moment, and maybe you could.
I would like to just briefly comment.
Sure, go ahead.
I don't like to sound like a Cassandra. As Beverly has said several times, the suffering of the people of Gaza is unspeakable. It's horrendous. And as people like Philippe Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, and many others have said, they have exhausted the vocabulary of the English language in order to describe what has befallen Gaza. And I don't want in any way to add to the despair that has already sunk in. But I think there is a misapprehension here. There is no possibility of negotiations with Hamas. And Hamas has recognized that with the assassination of Hania and the elevation of Sinwar was a statement. We have come to the conclusion there's no possibility of negotiating with Israel. Let's be clear, because the factual record, the documentary record, disappears before our eyes in the blink of an eye. Netanyahu has made clear that he's against any negotiations which might lead to a permanent ceasefire. He said, and the entire Israeli leadership agrees, we will agree to a temporary ceasefire. And once the hostages are released, then we continue until Hamas is annihilated. And the annihilation of Hamas effectively means, because you can't separate, as Mao Zedong, the Chinese communist leader, used to say, you can't separate the fish from the water. The annihilation of Hamas effectively means the annihilation of Gaza, as the Israelis like to say, to make Gaza uninhabitable and unlivable, so that the population, by hook or by crook, will gradually empty out of Gaza. The numbers now are between 100,000 and 300,000. Gazans have already found their way into Egypt. And the Israeli expectation is, if we make Gaza unlivable, which they effectively have, in my opinion, the estimates are it will take 10 to 15 years just to clear out the rubble from Gaza, let alone begin the reconstruction of Gaza, that the population will empty out. And so this talk of any kind of negotiations, in my opinion, is beside the point, because Israel has made clear it won't negotiate. Hamas has recognized you can't negotiate with Israel. If they didn't realize that over the last 7 months, they realized it with the assassination of Haniya, and they sent a signal with the elevation of Sinwar. We know that you will never negotiate with Sinwar. We understand that, but we also understand that it's impossible to negotiate with you.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Beverly Milton Edwards, Omar Rahman, and Norman Finkelstein. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.